Good afternoon. It's Friday, April 24th, and I have another lecture here for you on Foucault's history of sexuality. A quick remark before I start. One of you asked me where on Moodle to leave suggestions for essay topics for your second essays. Look under lecture announcements, and again, under lecture announcements, look for the heading second essay, where I've posted some remarks on your second essay, length, deadline, but also a call for suggestions regarding topics. And if you use that thread, you simply reply to what I posted there, then you can make suggestions for topics. And I hope that several of you will do that, so that we're able to generate topics that have come from your reading of the text, your questions, your interests, rather than my questions and my interests. I'm certainly be quite capable of formulating some essay topics, but it's better if they come from you. All right. So, the subject matter of today's lecture is chapter 2 of part 4 of the History of Sexuality, volume 1. This chapter is entitled Method, whereas the first one, which we studied last time, was entitled Objective. All right. This second chapter is the counterpart to chapter 1 in the following sense. In the chapter that we studied last time, Foucault explains how he does not want to conceive power. Or rather, let me put it differently, he explains a conception of power which was appropriate in former times when European countries were ruled by kings. This no longer being the case, the sovereign and legal conception of power is no longer appropriate. As Foucault says so memorably in the preceding chapter, we still think about power as though we hadn't cut off the head of the king. But we no longer live under monarchical rule, and therefore a conception of power which assumes that power comes, from this, is bundled in this sovereign figure and then is brought to bear on a society in a top-down fashion, is simply, this conception is no longer sophisticated, it is no longer supple enough to account for the way in which power functions, well, in these post-monarchical, postmodern times. And so now, in chapter 2, he turns more positively towards an attempt to define what power now is. This second chapter is difficult. I'm saying this after reading it about 10 times. Now, I just reread it this afternoon in order to be well prepared for this lecture. I've read it many times before, and still I do not understand every sentence that it contains. Why could that be? Well, first of all, why don't I understand every sentence it contains? Well, perhaps I'm not sufficiently bright. I'm only saying that kind of half-jokingly, in order to emphasize the distance between, some of these brilliant thinkers of the philosophical tradition and what we are trying to accomplish. But is probably not the whole truth. That's to say, my shortcomings, or if you find it difficult, your own intellectual shortcomings, sure, that could be part of it. Something else I think that is going on. Two things, perhaps. One, Foucault is himself, in this chapter, in this book, trying to articulate a conception of power that hasn't been articulated before. He's trying to do something new. And part of coming up with a new idea, introducing a new concept into philosophy or other branches of knowledge, has to do with, or involves the difficulty of coming up with the appropriate language. And that's what Foucault himself, I have the impression, that's what he is grappling with in this chapter. He's trying to come up with language for an understanding of power which is new. And therefore he has to come up with new language. And in this context, even his usual ability to write with great lucidity and clarity fails him somewhat. That is to say, there are sentences here that are, I wouldn't say impenetrable, but sentences that certainly you have to read 5 times before perhaps understanding what they might mean. Right, so did I say there were 2 possible explanations? I think I've only got one in the end. What I've got here in my notes is Foucault is trying to find language to express something new. Well, that's what I just tried to tell you. And because because he is engaged in this attempt to express something new. He himself is struggling with language. I've had this experience myself occasionally when I wrote. Just an example, years ago, of course, I had to write a doctoral dissertation, much of which was on Thomas Aquinas. And as I was trying to express there my insights regarding Thomistic metaphysics, I was grappling with language, simply with the right words and even sentence structures to communicate my insights. But then, interestingly enough, years later, when I tried to understand the same material, given the fact that I had grown intellectually, I found it possible to express the same things much more straightforwardly. So even look at Foucault. Years later, in writing about power, you will find that Foucault actually writes more clearly about it, as the ideas have settled more in his own mind. Okay. That was just as a matter of introduction. So don't be surprised if you find the chapter difficult. I'm finding it difficult, and there are intrinsic reasons for its difficulty, reasons that I just tried to explain. All right. At the beginning of the chapter, page 92, he says once again, it's kind of a summary of the preceding chapter, he says once again how he does not want to understand power. We know this at this point, but a summary never hurts. So, 92, just a few lines from the beginning of the chapter. By power, I do not mean power as a group of institutions and mechanisms that ensure the subservience of the citizens of a given state. So the emphasis here is group of institutions and mechanisms that ensure subservience. Again, this would be the description of, let's say, a king who uses certain institutions of the state to subdue his citizens. By power I do not mean either a mode of subjugation which, in contrast to violence, has the form of a rule. So how does a king keep his subjects under control? Well, either by imposing rules, or if these rules fail, or if the citizens don't respect the rules, then by becoming violent. Thirdly, I do not have in mind a general system of domination exerted by one group over another, a system whose effects, through successive derivations, pervade the entire social body. What he's alluding to here is the Marxist theory of power. See, a general system of domination exerted by one group over another. You know, the capitalists and the bourgeoisie dominating the proletariat, using particular institutions, laws, etc., to keep the mass of the population working and fundamentally enslaved. This, he says, is not, he is not saying that power never works that way, or has never worked that way. He's saying that is not how it works anymore. So, how does it work now in modern and contemporary societies? I will read you. Is it a long sentence? I think it's a very long sentence. Or is it a series? It's a very long sentence that begins on page 92. As I read the sentence, I will try to explain it a little bit. So now, 92, moving from a negative definition of what he believes power is not, to his own positive definition. It seems to me that power must be understood in the first instance as the multiplicity of force relations immanent in the sphere in which they operate and which constitute their own organization. Emphasis here is on force relations immanent in the sphere in which they operate and which constitute their own organization. So first of all, what is power? Power is force relations. It's not something that comes from a king or even a ruling class. That is to say, it's not possible to locate, to pinpoint the source of that power in a particular, substance, in a particular group of people, in a particular institution. Rather, power is force relations. Immanent in the sphere in which they operate. So again, if you have a king, if you have the bourgeoisie, the king and the bourgeoisie are not immanent to the sphere of power that they exercise. But the king is somebody who stands above society. The bourgeoisie is a group, is a class that stands over the proletariat. So, okay, Foucault is saying that's not an appropriate understanding of contemporary power. Rather, power is a group of force relations immanent in the sphere in which those force relations operate. Okay, I read on. It seems to be that power must be understood, blah, blah, as the process which, through ceaseless struggles and confrontations, transforms, strengthens, or reverses them. Again, the emphasis here is on the word that I would highlight in this particular phrase that I read to you is process. So we're dealing, as we're trying to understand power, we're dealing with a complex process. Okay. Thirdly, as the support which these force relations find in one another, thus forming a chain or a system. Or, on the contrary, the disjunctions and contradictions which isolate them from one another. What's the word that I would highlight here in this phrase that I read? Forming a chain or system. So, power is a system of force relations. And again, so a system that has a certain integrity, that must be understood on its own terms, that should not be understood simply as having put in place by some exterior power, again, such as a king, another class, another institution. But a very complex system. A system where force relations may support each other, or where they also may be in contradiction to one another. He speaks of disjunctions and contradictions. So this is a system that you have to imagine as full of tension, not homogeneous, but a system where certain power relations support each other, others contradict each other. Okay? And finally, and lastly, he writes, 92, very last line, as the strategies in which they take effect, whose general design or institutional crystallization is embodied in the state apparatus, in the formulation of the law, in the various social hegemonies. So the emphasis here is on strategies. So power relations, force relations, power relations, that group together, that act together to form strategies. Okay. Now this is, I'm not saying this is easy, really at all. Think of what's an example. Foucault, really, what is one of the difficulties of this chapter? He doesn't really give an example. He does not give examples. That makes it difficult. I think a very good example of how power operates in our contemporary world is the internet. Now, I'm not going to be able to, or even try to apply every aspect of Foucault's definitions given here in this chapter to the internet. But just think of the internet as, first of all, a web of power or force relations. Well, clearly, because people influence each other, people try to exert power over each other, such as, these famous influencers who appear on the internet in order to advertise products or ways of exercising, or movies, whatever it may be. So there are power relations going on, and then there are reactions to these influences, either agreement or disagreement. So it's a dynamic field where people interact. But again, you see, so who puts this internet in place? Well, it's not a king of any country. It's not the United Nations. It's not President Trump. See, I think you see what I'm trying to say. Who puts this internet in place and uses it as a kind of crude tool to exercise power. Rather, if you ask, for example, where's the center of the internet? Well, you can say, where's the center of the CIA? Where's the center of the FBI? Where's the center of the Irish Guards? Well, Phoenix Park thing, right? Where's the center of the internet? Answer, nowhere, right? So it doesn't have a center. It's this web of forces that are extremely complex, that don't all pull in the same direction, but some of which pull in different directions. And I think you can already see how this is a field of very dynamic power relations that is very different from, well, I just mentioned the guards. The guards still function largely on this older model of power. For example, COVID-19, the Irish government asks the guards, apparently this weekend again, to exercise a kind of old-fashioned type of power. Go out on the motorways and on the roads, make sure people don't drive around too much, okay? And compare that, as I just said, with the force relations of the internet. Very, very different, two very, very different models of power. Now, I think this example helps a bit. It helps me too. Think about it further. You know, if you have time and if you enjoy thinking about philosophy and about Foucault, read this chapter, and as you read this chapter, ask yourself, is the internet a good example to exemplify what Foucault is talking about? And by the way, there perhaps you have an interesting essay topic, where it would be quite a creative and interesting essay, because Foucault was writing, when did this book first appear? I think it first appeared 1978. See, that's before the time of the internet. But we can test Foucault's theory, if you will, and ask ourselves whether it is valid by applying it to this contemporary phenomenon of which Foucault didn't know yet. Okay. I move on. At the bottom of page 93, Foucault makes a very, very interesting remark to which he returns at the very end of the chapter on page 102, and I am also at the end going to come back to this remark. Foucault comments on the way in which politics and war, with this new understanding of power, have come to be confounded. If we still wish to maintain a separation between war and politics, he writes, isn't that an interesting way of putting it? If we still wish to maintain a separation between war and politics, and that very way of putting it suggests if we still wish to maintain this, but we don't have to, or perhaps we shouldn't maintain this division, perhaps we should postulate rather that this multiplicity of force relations can be coded either in the form of war or in the form of politics. So this web of force relations that he's been trying to describe in the just a couple of pages preceding the sentence I just read to you, these force relations can take two forms. One is the form of politics, another is the form of war. And what Foucault is suggesting is that politics and war are no longer that far removed from each other. And you know, just now it occurs to me, an example occurs to me of this. In the past, politics and war were certainly very, very different. Politics was the peacetime way of implementing social measures, of governing a society, of reaching social consensus, etc. And war used to be the opposite, something like a breakdown, civil war breakdown of social order, or a breakdown of international order. Germany and France no longer get along, they're no longer able to resolve their differences politically by the Monsieur le Président meeting the Chancellor, right? And so they start a war. But now, think of what... Now, this kind of war still exists. I mean, in many countries, even right now. Think of Yemen. But what is the paradigmatic contemporary form of war? Well, it's cyber warfare. And isn't that interesting? Then, you see, if you look at the internet as a manifestation of forces of contemporary politics, which would no doubt it is at the same time a manifestation of forces of contemporary war, and the two are very closely interwoven. Think of Russian and Chinese attempts to influence American and European politics by unleashing bots and stuff like this. So that would be a way where politics and war are almost identical, because of the new form of power that we see at work in contemporary society. Okay, again, I move on a little bit. On pages 94, and this is, by the way, a short chapter, just, I think it's fewer than 10 pages, but quite rich. Still, anyway, so on page 94, Foucault formulates what he calls a number of propositions. Propositions obviously propositions in which he attempts, having to do with his new understanding of power, propositions in which he attempts to flesh this out. 94, first point. Power is not something that is acquired, seized or shared, something that one holds onto or allows to slip away. power is exercised from innumerable points in the interplay of non-egalitarian and mobile relations. I think at this point I don't even have to explain this after the example I gave of the internet and the way in which I have now, perhaps even too often, as it's becoming a bit boring, invoked the way in which Foucault does not want to think of power in terms of a king or some central dominating authority, but rather it is exercised from innumerable points. Again, think of the internet. Power on the internet is exercised from innumerable points. I move on to the next point. Relations of power are not in a relation of exteriority with respect to other types of relationships, and he mentions a few in parentheses, but are immanent in the latter. Well, what does he want to say here? Well, if we look at, I should actually focus on what is in the parentheses. Relations of power are not in a position of exteriority with respect to other types of relationships, parentheses and examples, economic processes, knowledge relationships, sexual relations, and one could go on giving examples, but are immanent in the latter. So don't look at economic processes as then having an element of power exercised on them or having an element of power in addition to them. Rather, economic processes are inherently force relations and involve power in the way in which Foucault understands it. Knowledge relationships. In knowledge relationships, there is an element of power involved as well, an element of force. And sexual relations. Well, that's very much a subject of contemporary debate. It's difficult to construct a relationship with a sexual element that is free of any kind of power or force. Okay. But there are inequalities, there's a struggle to reach equality, perhaps a struggle to prevent that equality from being accomplished, etc., etc. Next point, power comes from below. That is, but perhaps, you see, that is perhaps more important is what he says in the next few words. That is, there is no binary and all-encompassing opposition between rulers and ruled at the root of power relations. So again, the older, now inadequate conception of power was binary. Those who have power as opposed to those who don't have power. The king has power or the landlord has power. But the ordinary subjects who rent the land have no power. The subjects of the king have no power. Foucault wants to say, well, he puts it in a somewhat exaggerated way, power comes from below. I think what he wants to say is power neither comes from above nor from below, or it comes from above and from below, or one should perhaps not even speak of above and below, because rather what is happening in contemporary society is that power is this complex network involving nodes, points in the network that interact with each other, and that must be seen as co-constitutive, as interacting, rather than being viewed as being above and below. Again, take the example of the internet. A simple influencer on the internet. Who could that be? Well, it could just be the proverbial man or woman in the street. Can, as an influencer, become as powerful as the Taoiseach. Well, is that really true? As powerful, but quite powerful. Look at, internet fora that contain conspiracy theories regarding all kinds of stuff. What's more powerful now, the official government line on what coronavirus is, or the conspiracy theory? It's not clear what's more powerful, what's more influential, and there you can see that above and below have come to be confounded. Now comes a even more difficult point. Well, it's not that difficult. I keep emphasizing how difficult it is. It is somewhat difficult, but not impenetrable either, right? That's the bottom of the page. Stuff begins really quite interesting. 94. Power relations are both intentional and non-subjective. Well, first of all, let me explain the words, if it's necessary. Well, what's subjective? Well, for example, I'm a subject, and, I exercise intentional power. My intention is to teach you Foucault and some philosophy, I'm a subject, and I exercise the power that I have, the awful power, to give marks, in order to reach a particular goal, intention. The goal is to teach, to make sure students study the material, etc., etc. So that would be a kind of power that is intentional and subjective. I'm a subject. What about a power that is intentional and non-subjective? That is, according to Foucault, the power that is most notable, that is most paradigmatic in contemporary society. I'll explain in a second. After reading you another few words, a part of a sentence that occurs on page 95. So what is this power which is intentional and non-subjective? The logic, he says, is perfectly clear. The aims decipherable. And yet it is often the case that no one is there to have invented them. What he's talking about is systems that have a very clear objective, but are not run by anyone in particular. And again, of course, I try to come up with an example. Foucault, alas, doesn't give us an example, just leaving us there, wondering what he's talking about. A good example, I think, would be the current economic model, which is completely dependent upon consumption. So there is an intention in this system. The intention is to make people consume, to make people purchase items. I mean, is this not perhaps the major objective of contemporary politics? To keep consumption up, to keep the economy growing? I guess it is. I would say it is, right? Who's behind that? Now, again, you could have a conspiracy theory and say, well, it's President Trump, or, it's somebody in some subterranean bunker somewhere. But the thing about that theory is that it's too primitive. It doesn't do, and therefore it's ineffectual, because it doesn't do justice to the actual situation. If you say our current economic paradigm is due to some conspiracy, then it's easy, in some sense, to remedy the situation, because all you need to do is overthrow the conspiracy, identify the conspiracy and overthrow it. Which is, which is why by some conspiracy theories that one comes across, which, for example, are abundant in the United States. When I lived in the United States, there was, for example, this conspiracy theory involving Hillary Clinton and all that. And then what do we need to do in order to liberate ourselves? Well, imprison Hillary Clinton or something like that. Well, that's very easy, isn't it? That's still like cutting off the head of the king. That's still thinking about power in old-fashioned kind of revolutionary terms. But what if the logic of the system in which we live actually is intentional, has a goal or purpose, but it's non-subjective? Who is responsible for the current economic system? Again, is it the head of Microsoft? Well, no. Who? Well, see, interesting. No one in particular. It kind of runs on its own. Which is interesting. But you see, now you could say, if this is the case, then how can we resist? And the answer might suggest itself, we don't have a chance to resist. There's no way even to question this system or to stop it. But then Foucault moves on to the next point, which is interesting, 95, where there is power, there is resistance. And yet, or rather consequently, this resistance is never in a position of exteriority in relation to power. Should it be said that one is always inside power, there's no escaping it, there is no absolute outside where it is concerned, because one is subject to the law in any case, or that history being the ruse of reason, power is the ruse of history, always emerging the winner, this would be to misunderstand the strictly relational character of power relationships. So what Foucault wants to say is, resistance works within the system of power, not outside. Again, sorry for kind of belaboring this one example that I'm so happy to have come up with. There is a king who rules unjustly. Okay. How does one overcome this situation of unjust rule? Well, the king is overthrown, assassinated, executed. Simple solution. Well, simple, structurally simple, politically simple, easy to implement in a particular historical situation. No, that's not what I'm saying. But structurally simple. But now, if power works in this kind of overarching system of power relations, than simply identifying an imaginary anchor point for this system and trying to overthrow this imaginary anchor point doesn't work. But does that mean resistance is futile? No, it doesn't mean that. It only means that resistance is always already in the system. I use the example of the internet again. In the internet, power and resistance to power operate in the same way and at the same levels. It's a constant toing and froing, if you will. By the way, I would really be excited if some of you can write an essay on this question of Foucauldian power and the internet. I would be even more excited if one or two of you perhaps want to do a master's thesis on it. And honestly, I would be excited because it's very, very interesting to use a major thinker like that, like Foucault, to think about our contemporary situation and see what one can do with such a theory. Do in the sense of, well, first of all, understand, but then perhaps also do in the sense of understand our contemporary situation, and by understanding it, well, mastering is not the word that Foucault would use, but coming to grips with it, finding one's place with it. I think that's certainly an important aspect of what philosophy is about. So, now, in the next part of the chapter, Foucault moves to apply what he has now said about power to the question of sexuality. Quick remark in parentheses, as I've already pointed out a couple of times, this book, History of Sexuality, Volume 1, is a book about sexuality and about power. And the two themes are intertwined. They're connected with each other. Sometimes Foucault will focus on, at the beginning he focused on sexuality, but then it became clear that in order to understand the contemporary constitution of sexuality, one needed to understand power. So now he focused on power. Now he comes back to sexuality in order to apply to sexuality the ideas that he's just formulated in relation to power. So now, how to study, because that's still the objective of the book. He's writing a history of sexuality. So how to write the history of sexuality now in light of these insights that we've gained regarding power? He formulates a number of rules, 98, 99, 100. And we're already at the end of the chapter. So the first rule that he formulates, he calls the rule of immanence. What's the best way to summarize this? He writes, it's at about the center of the page on 98. Between techniques of knowledge and strategies of power, there is no exteriority, even if they have specific roles and are linked together on the basis of their difference. Foucault has already explained that he believes that the contemporary way of constituting sexuality and of thinking about sexuality has to do with knowledge. I'm reminding you of the previous chapter. So sexuality is no longer something in the contemporary society, in the contemporary world, that simply serves for procreation. Neither is it something that simply serves for pleasure, but it's rather that our constant talking about sexuality gives us a pleasure that doesn't come from having sex, but that comes from talking about it. And so therefore knowledge and pleasure in the contemporary constitution of sexuality are intertwined. And now he introduces another factor, which is power. So in this first rule of immanence, and then I would like to draw your attention to a expression that he employs on page 99. If you look about 10 lines down, underline in your copy of the book the expression power knowledge, which he simply spells with a hyphen. Power knowledge. In the sense he wants to say they belong to the same complex. They interpenetrate each other. They always go hand in hand. So all knowledge. Now does that mean all knowledge is used to oppress people? Again, you see, that would be the old way of thinking about power. Rather, that's not what it means. Knowledge is always part of this complex network of forces which, according to Foucault, constitutes contemporary power. Knowledge is not extrinsic to that. Okay? So, therefore, rule of immanence, don't consider power, knowledge, and sexuality as extrinsic to each other. So don't think of sexuality as something that can be the object of power or the object of knowledge. Rather think of sexuality as something that is already part of a network of power and knowledge relationships. Yeah. So, look, just trying to understand this myself, or perhaps giving an example. As we constitute ourselves in the contemporary world as sexual beings, and we constitute ourselves means we think of ourselves, of our identity, of who we are. I think that's the case even in Ireland. I'm saying even in, why am I saying even in Ireland? Because I think that Ireland in some ways is different from, let's say, the United States. I think also that rural Ireland is different from urban Ireland in that. But you are a better judge of that. Let me ask it in the form of the question, and you can answer that question negatively for yourself and think about it further. Here's my hypothesis. Even in contemporary Ireland, which is not like the United States, when people constitute their identities, ask themselves who they are, is not one of the first questions, or the first question that they ask, who am I sexually? No. That would illustrate then one of the major theses of this book, that sexuality has assumed this central role in defining who we are. Okay, but then immediately as I define myself as belonging to a particular sexual group or subgroup, that is supposed to bestow knowledge to me about myself, who I am, but also give other people knowledge of who I am. Sexually, I have to tell you now, I am such and such. Well, I've defined myself, I now know more about myself. I've revealed my real self to myself, but also to you. But then also, of course, power relationships. So in constituting myself as being sexually such and such, I situate myself in the power grid of society in a certain way. For example, if I say, I have to tell you now I belong to a sexual minority. Well, then I've constituted myself as a minority and as someone who is already in a position such that he or she has to offer resistance to a mainstream discourse, etc. So you see, that's how I would try to illustrate this kind of network of sexuality, knowledge, and power. Ask yourself, I think that Foucault has a point here, I know it from other societies, ask yourself if this is true of contemporary Ireland and also of your generation. And if, it's interesting, if it's not true, well, then, then there is in Ireland still an older way of thinking about self and identity. But probably, my hypothesis would be, in Ireland, the older way, well, frankly, what kind of way would that be? That would be an older Catholic way, which also emphasizes sexuality, but in a completely different way. And this more kind of postmodern way probably still, form a complex network of power relations, as Foucault would say. Anyway, so much for that. Number 2, on page 99, rules of continual variations. I think, so that's a difficult paragraph. If I wanted to summarize it in a word, which is what I'm trying to do, so that I don't have to explain it sentence by sentence, because of the difficulty of it, rules of continual variations means think of power in relation to sexuality as something that is process. As something that is not static. See, rule of continual variations. Don't think that it's possible to define power relations in the sexual field once and for all in a particular static way. But things keep moving. Don't offer simplistic explanations. The current sexual situation is such and such. No, it's constantly moving. It's constantly undergoing variation. 3. Rule of double conditioning. Again, he does not express himself in straightforward ways. He really does not. I'm not going to try to explain again why that is, but I'm kind of baffled myself by some of the things that he says. 3, rule of double conditioning. I think what this is about is I'll read you the first sentence. No local center, no pattern of transformation could function if, through a series of sequences, it did not eventually enter into an overall strategy. And inversely, no strategy could achieve comprehensive effects if it did not gain support from precise and tenuous relations serving, not as its point of application or final outcome, but as its prop and anchor point. So, you see, he's oscillating there between, or he's trying to define the relationship between two poles, if you will. One is the pole of overall strategy, which means coherence of a certain field of power. And then the other pole in these two opposites is local center, is props and anchor points. So how to understand power? Well, on the one hand, it's this complex field, but the complex field also requires anchor points, nodes, props, as he says here. So in order to understand power properly, one has to bear in mind both the individual supports for it. Supports, what could that be? It could be particular institutions, particular people, etc. On the one hand, but on the other hand, the complex field to which these belong. And fourthly, finally, 100, page 100, rule of the tactical polyvalence of discourses. To explain this, I'm going to read to you I think it's the third sentence in this particular section. To be more precise, he writes, we must not imagine a world of discourse divided between accepted discourse and excluded discourse, or between the dominant discourse and the dominated one, but as a multiplicity of discursive elements that can come into play in various strategies. So tactical polyvalence of discourses. He gives so shall I try to explain it first in an abstract way? Well, I'll try the abstract way first, then we'll come to the example, which this time he himself provides. Abstract explanation. A discursive field. What is that? A discursive field. An area in which power and force relations express themselves in discourse and speech. This field is never unambiguous. There's always going to be discourses that oppose each other and that pull in different directions, drawing on the same resources, using the same words, using the same ideas, just taking them in different ways. The example that Foucault gives on page 101 is very famous, and there's an expression that he uses that likewise is very famous. 101, he speaks of reverse discourse. In French, for those of you who are interested in French or perhaps are even looking at the book in French, discours en retour. That's what it is in French. The reverse discourse. What is reverse discourse? Reverse discourse is the way in which a marginalized and oppressed group uses the categories deployed in a mainstream discourse to oppress that group in order for that oppressed group to affirm itself. Okay? And there you can see what he means by polyvalence. The example that he gives is homosexuality, and I'm going to read to you the few lines at the bottom of page 101 where he discusses that. Reverse discourse. Homosexuality began to speak in its own behalf. Well, no, I have to start a little bit earlier. Sorry. There is no question that the appearance in 19th century psychiatry, jurisprudence and literature of a whole series of discourses on the species and subspecies of homosexuality, inversion, pederasty and psychic hermaphrodism made possible a strong advance of social controls into this area of, quotation marks, perversity. So you see in the 19th century, what does he say here? Medicine, law, literature come up with this discourse about, and again the terminology used varies. Homosexuality, we're no longer even familiar with this way. People who are inverted, who are sexually inverted, or who are, and this term we no longer use at all, people who are psychic hermaphrodites. Okay? And so this discourse, of course, is meant to marginalize, it's meant to ostracize. But then, okay, then Then, however, against that, homosexuality began to speak in its own behalf, to demand that its legitimacy or naturality be acknowledged, often in the same vocabulary. Note, see, even the word homosexuality is a 19th century invention. It was invented to, we would use the term, discriminate against a group, to ostracize a group, to marginalize a group. So you are homosexual and therefore something's wrong with you. Go on a few decades, and this person who was ostracized says, well, yes, I'm a homosexual, and I think I deserve equal rights, and I don't want to be discriminated against, using the very term which was created to ostracize. Okay? So that's what he means by reverse discourse. Another way to put this, one could use the category of the natural. Is homosexuality unnatural? And then using the same terms, advocates of gay rights would say, well, no, I mean, it's a genetic thing. It's built into, our genetic makeup. And so it's as much part of my nature as your sexuality is part of your nature. Again, that would be an example of a reverse discourse, where you can see, well, actually, the Foucault's designation works. Polyvalence of discourses. A discourse perhaps was created to discriminate, but it turns out to be polyvalent. It can also be used to affirm. Would be good if you could come up with other examples apart from the Foucauldian one here. Again, see possible essay topic. That is to say, how in what other areas of life, of society, can you see such a reverse discourse? We're at the end, page 102. Am I going to read? I'm going to read the entire final paragraph to you. 102, concluding paragraph of the chapter. In short, it is a question of orienting ourselves to a conception of power which replaces the privilege of the law with the viewpoint of the objective. The objective, not the objective in the sense of as opposed to subjective. The objective is the purpose, the goal. The privilege of prohibition with the viewpoint of technical efficacy. The privilege of sovereignty with the analysis of a multiple and mobile field of force relations, wherein far-reaching but never completely stable effects of domination are produced. The strategical model, rather than the model based on law. The strategical model, rather than the model based on law. So how to understand power in the contemporary society? Not in terms of law, but in terms of strategy. It's a complex strategy. And this not out of speculative choice or theoretical preference, but because in fact it is one of the essential traits of Western societies that the force relationships which for a long time had found expression in war, in every form of warfare, gradually became invested in the order of political power. Remember when we began today's lecture, I read a similar sentence to you. Now Foucault returns to this. Very, very provocative and very interesting thesis here. So, strategies that used to be strategies of war, because you see, what is war? War is also this complex interplay of forces, of this army advancing on the other army, but then, etc., etc., And this model, he says, now is actually what has penetrated the field of contemporary politics. Interesting, but also that's a threatening thesis, isn't it? So contemporary politics is a form of war, he's saying. Is that true? Interesting. Interesting stuff. So, that was today's lecture. Look, as always, thanks for your perseverance in reading this book. I hope you're enjoying it a little bit. I am, I have to say, I do like philosophy. It's interesting stuff. It's pity that I can't get your feedback and see what you think about this and get some questions from you. But that's perhaps what the essays are for. So I'm actually looking forward. The midterm essays were graded by Thomas Marsden, as you know, although I read several of them myself. The final essays I'm going to read, and I look forward to that because I look forward to your reflections on this material, not only to see if you've understood it, but to see what you think of it, how you were able to apply it to other fields, etc., etc. So again, look, many thanks. I hope you're doing well, and I'll record another lecture for you, well, either on Monday evening or something. Monday morning I have a meeting. Anyway, all the best now. Bye-bye.